Okay. All right. So let's go back to the chat.
Okay.
Somebody was saying. Okay. Just a question to the at-home audience online. Are you hearing us now? Well, can you please write a message? Good.
Yes.
Okay. Super.
Wonderful. We will start now.
Okay. Super. Well, thank you everyone for coming today. We're excited to be able to present this project, which we've been working on for 6 months. This is a project investigating worldview. It's a historical research into the various labors of worldview and the various laborers who have made worldview over the past 200 years across the globe. We've made a few selections as to where we're focusing. This project was funded by the Dutch Research Council, NVO, and I'm very happy about that because it allowed me to hire 2 excellent postdoctoral researchers, Victor Cova, who is an anthropologist who works on Latin American indigenous groups and missionaries, and Hugo Hogenbirk, who's both a philosopher and a digital humanist. So we are each going to talk a bit and present a kind of what's happened after 6 months view of our project. And I'll start off just giving a little bit of an overview of what the project is about. I'm very happy also to have people online. I think there are as many people online right now as offline, including some of the future speakers in this lecture series. So at the end, we'll give you the program going forward, but this is launching essentially a monthly seminar series on aspects relating to worldview, cosmovisión, ontology, and such things that are very interesting for humanities scholars, I think, broadly. So we will later give a chance to people online also to respond. So the name of the project that's been funded is Modern Worldviews and Culture Wars, a Transnational Conceptual History, 1790 to the Present. And I will try to just explain the rationale. So many colleagues in this faculty use terms similar to worldview or worldview to kind of encompass both the secular and the religious. Words that are coming up increasingly in scholarship are ontology, ontologies, even worlding. Some of our fellows like to use the term worlding, obviously worldviews. So it's a key concept in the study of religion today, and it's also emerging across the globe and spreading very quickly as a term that has a polemical character as well. So, for instance, some Hindutva intellectuals are arguing that Hindutva offers an answer to the Western worldview. There's a book from Turkey on Islamic worldview, recent publication, Cosmovision Andina, so Andean worldview, or Indian indigenous worldviews. And then, of course, in anthropology, people talk about the ontological turn. So it's a very important concept and deserves some attention for that reason. If you think also about contemporary usage, American evangelicals consider Christian worldview a core concept to doing mission work today. At the same time, in the Netherlands, the term Levensbeschouwing onderwijs is a term that is used now increasingly to replace religious education in schools. So there's diverse usage going on. Now, we know from history of concepts that concepts, of course, are not neutral. They emerge within power relations. People have tied the scientific development of concepts to use of concepts in society and also use by the state. And if you take 2 such terms, religion and the secular, they've both been the object of a lot of conceptual historical research. Just to take religion, Chris Bailey, who's a British historian, wrote a book on globalization in the 19th century. And in his chapter on religion, he showed how the concept of religion, which emerged in the, particularly from the British perspective, out of Protestant Christianity, how this very concept, which was constructed largely with the model of Protestant Christianity, focused on belief, systematic theology, how that idea was then taken abroad in the colonial and missionary outreach of the 19th century, and other religious groups, Buddhists, Hindus, and so on, actually had to, or thought that they should respond to the Protestant theory of religion by constructing Hindu theology or Buddhist theology. So the term was part of colonialism. It was part of a specific historical tradition in the West. And the same has been done with secularism as a term. Now, both of those, the research around religion and the secular, I think, if you want to characterize recent developments, has approached it from the position of hegemonic forces, right? Global Protestantism, colonialism, the modern state. So the approach has been to say these concepts have developed, in a sense, in the service of or as part of the expression of the power of hegemonic forces. And in this project, we're taking a different path, and we're trying to look at other dynamics. So we're not looking at hegemonic actors. The idea instead is to look at culture wars. And the notion of culture war, you'll know from the American context, the current election, all of these hot button topics that are discussed. Culture wars always have to do with religion and the secular in some way. And what I would suggest to you is that they are not hierarchically arranged. They're rather more horizontally arranged. So we're interested in the way that polemics within the kind of culture war framework are shaping concepts. And the term that I've kind of developed as a more, I don't know, scientific term or a different term than culture war is apologetics. So in theology, apologetics are the apparatus of the church that develops around defense of the faith. And apologists are always involved in the scientific study of the opponent, defense of the faith, the articulation of the faith in the field of contest. So I thought that's an interesting way to conceive of modern politics, and particularly debates about religious secular issues outside of churches, but involving churches. So I did a book with Hugh MacLeod on essentially using this idea of the apologetic field to try to articulate key dynamics of 20th century history. So what we're doing in this project is trying to look at the history of worldview within the apologetic field. That's essentially the core question. So we are then looking at three domains, let's say, in this struggle. The first one are the kind of social struggles out in society that you might call culture wars. And here I'm suggesting that we really need to look at the conceptual work being done out there in the world in struggle by churches, by secular groups, by political actors, and so on. The second one is that we're very interested in scientific concept formation. So let's say academic research, academic theory formation around worldview has always played into the definitions of worldview being used in culture wars. So we're interested in that connection there. And I would say as a hypothesis that key concepts such as ontology, ideas about paradigms, this emerges in part out of engagement with the term worldview. And then the third aspect is in the 20th century, and we'll get to this, worldview begins to shape legal management of religious conflicts or secular religious conflicts. And it gets picked up now by law. We see laws being passed with reference to worldview, constitutional changes now with worldview, and also, of course, religious education with worldview. What we want to do now is to try to show you a little bit of what we're doing with this essential framework. And these are essentially all the publications of this project. And they're all collaborative, not all of them, but they're generally collaborative. And we're going to sort of pass off a bit now and give you some insights. So the first one deals with kind of how it moves from philosophy into the public sphere, into the culture wars. The second project is really about the culture wars. The third one is doing comparisons. The fourth one looks at, begins Victor's work, which is about the history of anthropology and cosmovision as a particular important concept, and then how that gets linked now to climate change activism and indigenous rights activism. So those are the projects, and I'm going to turn over now to Hugo.
first want to say something, so people say that the PowerPoint slides are not moving.
Ah, okay.
See.
But then we have to just use the, we have to advance them from here.
No, because here it's moved, and on what we see, things have moved. Let's see, we cannot see the slides. Okay, now you can see them.
Yes, but it's only probably after we
Okay,
moved it.
and then how can we do both?
You have to be able to request after share.
Yeah, but that, so,
Yes.
Can you help us? Are you in the audience?
wait, or can we do this from,
Sorry.
can we do it from,
Let him do it. Let him do it.
yeah, do it.
Anyway, just like to say hello to everyone in the room. Thank you all for coming. I would like to introduce Annette. What's your last name? Woodberg from psychology, history of psychology. Some students from the MA, I believe, BA students. Pat Jackson, who gave a talk yesterday. Slavery debates in the American churches. Paul Kurtz, who's a philologist working in Europe, out of urban intent. Julia Hanich from film. My PhD student, Balthazar Acevedo, PhD students and MA students in the back. Christoph Edam, who's our department chair, and also essentially an intellectual historian, also history of philosophy, I would say, or philosopher. And Imani Naip, who's helping with the audiovisual, and someone presented yesterday from Colombia. Okay. Yeah, a PhD student visiting. Okay,
It's working.
good.
Thanks. So, chronologically, the first project that we're working on, Descent of Worldview, is also, so it's the first project, it's also chronologically the first project. So it introduces the idea that worldview it starts a very particular sort of intellectual field, and then it ends up in a different one. So what I have here for you are two word clouds, basic word clouds. So they sort of give you an idea of the words most associated with worldview, Weltanschauung in German text archives, between 1800 and 1850 and 1850 and 1900. So what we see in the first period is that we see words that are mostly related to philosophical activity. We have, for example, moralisch will come directly from Hegel's account of Kant, the philosopher Kant being a moralische Weltanschauung and stuff like this. So we have this kind of context where history, morality, also sometimes Indologists writing about worldview. So we have Krishna there as one of the most strongly related terms for worldview in this period. And at the same time, we have a short while later in the same sort of archive, we get a completely different picture, namely one where we see the beginning of the battle of worldviews, or we see the start of a apologetic use of worldview, where we have monistic or materialistic worldview, often opposed to religious or dualist worldview. Right? So what we start with is a very broad usage, where we have all kinds of different things that can be associated with worldview, and it gets condensed into a discussion that's about one particular topic, namely the opposition between materialist or monist worldview against the Christian or old worldview.
So I can ask a question about this specifically. Could you make also a different case, saying that whereas in the early phase it was about the other, about the culturally strange from the other side of the world, it came uncannily close to home in the later phase, because suddenly people have realized that their own religion is part of this cosmos where this discourse is taking place, needs to take. So is it not also from let's say safely far away to this strikes home?
So there's two phases in this first part. So there's really an initial phase where it's not even for the culturally other, but then there's a period where it really starts sort of becoming a cultural descriptor of those far away. And clearly here we're dealing with internal affairs at that point. So I agree with that. What's interesting, or one of the interesting things about this development, is that whereas you might expect the concept to just keep adding on and adding on new information and new associations over time, we get a reduction, right? We get something that has many uses that gets reduced in only a few. So this for us raises the question, how did this initial period of descent, as we want to call it, right, from intellectual activity into local political affairs, how did this happen? So, and maybe none of you would suspect this may be a very naive approach, but maybe your first thought would be, well, I can just look at those initial philosophers who tell us what worldview is, and maybe they're right, and people have just worked with that concept from there on out. So we would look at, for example, The Way to the Blessed Life, which is by the philosopher Fichte, which is the first sort of systematic, or at least it's the first systematic account of worldview that we have, or that we have found so far. But clearly, if we already look at the transformation that takes place, whatever those philosophers are doing can't be exactly what happens afterwards. So there's something very useful and helpful about looking at them, and I'll show you a little bit in the next slide about what it is that they did that we might recognize or that might have had effect on these later culture wars. But at the same time, we should also expect that not only intellectuals working on concepts, but also popular usage or political usage should transform the concept itself. Okay. I'll tell you a little bit about this very early sort of philosophical use that we've seen so far, and then after that I'll give over to Todd, who will tell a little bit more about the politicizing part of it. So what we see, one of the ways we could go about this is, well, if we want to look at intellectuals in this period of time, there's one group of intellectuals who are dominating the philosophical landscape, and those are the German idealists, probably all across Europe, in any case in Germany. Additionally, the first ever use of Weltanschauung was by a German idealist, the philosopher Immanuel Kant, so we can look there and see how this transformation moves along this German idealist line. And there is something of a line to be discovered there. So for Kant, we get a maybe somewhat sad conclusion, namely that for him, Weltanschauung wasn't that important of a concept. So he uses it once, and most interpreters will take it as, well, it really was just an Anschauung of the world. Not even all of it, just an experience of things out there. And he just put those together into one word, and a history was born after that. And that history was born very quickly because Fichte himself will be the one who will take up worldview after that very quickly. And it's unclear whether he thinks Kant meant anything of this sort, or whether he's completely misunderstanding it, or in the end, that doesn't matter. Maybe it matters to some extent, but what we see with Fichte becomes a Weltanschauung as something where we think of it as a total way of understanding the world. So it becomes an intellectual activity. We might have materialists, people who think everything is matter, and then we might have idealists who are in a different worldview because they understand better than the materialists that everything is actually spirit. And this turns into a five-fold hierarchy of worldviews. So we're not yet at the cultural usage where there might be many, but at least there's a few possible options. And what's very interesting about Fichte's use, and I'll read out the quote, is the dialectics of opposite worldviews. So he'll say, some people are placed on a higher standing point from which to survey the world. And these people are as little understood by those around them as they, on their part, are unable to understand their contemporaries. So what this does give us for later culture wars is sort of this initial idea that people in different worldviews have a hard time communicating with each other, right? Even if you're in the better one, which Fichte will be glad to admit that there's better and better and better ones, even then you don't get a real grasp of what the people in the worst worldview are even up to. And that makes discussion among them difficult. So there is no argumentative discussion among worldviews. Okay. So from there, we go on to Hegel. I won't go through a whole quote for him, but for him, Weltanschauung becomes something more akin to the cultural usage. So, he'll write in the Lectures on Aesthetics, Weltanschauung is something that is particular to a time and people. Right? It's particular to some time, some people in that time. But he retains from Fichte this idea of the problem of communicability across these different Weltanschauungen. As he'll describe, well, the Weltanschauung becomes also a way of life that inhibits our thought to such a degree that it becomes difficult, that the moment we step out of it and have a clear view of it, we're already in something else. We're already alienated from whatever it was that we were dealing with initially. Okay. So what this shows us as a very quick idea of what the philosophers have achieved is an expansion of the concept. So maybe what we would have expected to see initially, right? Worldview gets to do more and more work. The concept gets a life of its own. And whereas for Fichte, it's still a sixfold, whereas for Kant, it's nothing, right? For Hegel, we have almost anything can be a worldview at some point in his writings. That's an expansion. But what this does not explain is where we end up, which is a reduction again towards a binary of worldview, which is what I'll give over to Tom.
Great, thank you, Hugo. So Hugo and I are dividing labors here. So he's working on this early intellectual history, and I'm trying to then explain the second bit, which is how we move towards reduction, but also amplification of worldview. So worldview becomes one of the core concepts of modern German theology and politics by the end of the 19th century. So it's not by reading Hegel and Fichte that happens. What we see is in the 1830s and 40s, a number of key intellectuals start to popularize the term. So one of them is Johann Jacobi. He's a Jewish reformer from Königsberg. He's seen as a follower of Kant, and he's very involved in political struggles of the so-called Vormärz, the pre-March. He uses it a lot in many different ways, but he himself is involved in the Revolution of 1848. He's a key player, and we see that there's a number of people in the Revolution of 1848 who start to say, they mobilize now around worldview. It's no longer something that just other people have or that I apply to the Greeks or the Hebrews. It's now my worldview, our worldview. So we start to see the formation of political groups around the concept of worldview. And we also start to see this binary arrangement being mobilized like politically and religiously, apologetically. So there was Eduard Balzer was a Protestant radical who started to have a series of lectures in 1848 or so, where he started to talk about the alte and neue Weltanschauung, the old and the new. And the old was Christianity, Catholicism and Orthodox Protestantism, and the new was sort of scientific, enlightened, progressive, yes, Christian to an extent, but moving beyond Christianity, his worldview. And a nice image that I like that sort of really shows this in a picture. This is from the execution of Robert Blum. So Robert Blum was a member of a kind of radical Christian sect in Leipzig that were called the German Catholics, not the Roman Catholics, the German Catholics. But effectively, they rapidly moved towards embracing natural scientific monism. So they moved away from dualism, away from belief in God and Christianity, and only believed in immanent reality. So he was a revolutionary as well. He led troops on the barricade in Vienna. He was captured and he was executed by the authorities. And here's the Catholic priest, because he's nominally Catholic, offering him the last rites. And you can see he says no. And you can see he's in light, and the priest, of course, is in dark. He has the... That's the image. So this is sort of explains, let's say, how worldview politically becomes then reduced to this binary distinction between old and new, scientific and Christian. So I'll now bridge into the second publication, which is a monograph, and this is now trying to look at how worldview gets arranged. So let's say in space over time through culture wars. Now the secularists, I would argue, have tried to monopolize the term. So they try to define old and new, and for a time I think they're pretty successful, but it gets more complicated, and that's the complication I want to talk about. What happens when Christians embrace the idea of worldviews, right? So I start off with the secular worldview, the one I just mentioned, and then I'm interested in how it starts to gain ever more positions and definitions. They always talk in binaries. But actually there are multiple positions, and each one is developing a specific definition of worldview, and each one is a kind of a political camp, if you so will. So the idea there is that if we study this phenomenon, we learn about how concepts form material relations in conflict situations, and how actually camps emerge around worldview. And with some of them, such as Christian advocates of Christian worldview, it informs their entire way of organizing themselves as a church. So the first one I'll just mention, I'm only going to talk about the first four quickly. Okay, well, so this is what I was just saying. So the idea is I'm going to study how worldview gets in camps, how, in a sense, each new definition of worldview establishes a relationship to the others. Okay, so they share, actually, in their struggle with one another. And eventually we're interested in how they move transnationally, and how concept travels and becomes involved in new culture wars that are not identical with the German original. Okay, so what's interesting in the late 19th century is you have key Protestant theologians who look at the term worldview, Weltanschauung, and they say there is something in there that is valuable for Christians to learn. And the key one, probably if you had to choose one, he's the most important, Abraham Kuyper, the Dutch theologian, conservative, neo-Orthodox Calvinist, and he describes contemporary Dutch life as a binary struggle of worldviews, modernism versus Christianity, essentially. And what's interesting in his thinking is he looks at worldview, he defines it apologetically in a battle formation, and he justifies it out of the battle. So the quote is, "If the battle is to be fought with honor and with hope of victory, then principle must be arrayed against principle. Then it must be felt that in modernism, the vast energy of an all-embracing life system assails us. Then also it must be understood that we have to take our stand in a life system of equally comprehensive and far-reaching power." So he's looking at modernism as a life system. And the reason he's using that term is because he's speaking English. He's in Princeton. In English, there's not the word worldview yet. Okay, so people come up with synonyms. So life system. So he's very clearly talking about it. And if we could go into more detail, but I would suggest that Protestant theologians are borrowing both from the philosophical definitions of worldview, but also from the polemical definitions that secularists are using. So it has to be total, it has to be positive, that's based on some foundation. In the case of Christian worldview, it's going to be based on biblical inerrancy, right? The truth of the Bible. And out of it, you derive structures that you're going to be using in battle. So Kuyper found schools, universities, newspapers, political parties. And that's all part of Christian worldview. And American Christians take that on. So if you look at American post-war evangelical movements, they are essentially doing that as well. Okay. So the third to look at would be political worldviews. What's interesting about political worldview is that concept emerges quite late. It's only in 1910 that Max Weber, the German sociologist, speaks of Weltanschauungsparteien, so worldview parties. Interesting because the culture wars had already been going on for 40 years. So it just tells you that even though today, if you ask people what is worldview, they may think it's political ideology. Yes, that's true, but it only emerges quite late in the game. And what's interesting, and when I've done this, if you look at the way Hitler uses Weltanschauung, he defines it against Catholicism and Marxism. So he studies these two other worldviews and comes up with National Socialist worldview as, you know, in the logic of culture wars. He's not, that's important when you look at Hitler's actual use of the term. And then the last one then, so these are three positive definitions of worldview, right? Take National Socialist worldview. For Hitler and the National Socialists, it is the key concept of their entire regime. They don't speak of philosophy, they don't speak of ideology, they may talk about belief, but it's Weltanschauung, that's the key one. Christian worldview, very positive associations. Secularist worldview, well, scientific worldview, people stand behind that positively. But we also have negative definitions of worldview. And the key one would be developed by liberals from the 1870s onwards in Germany and then also in the United States. So just to mention, after the Second World War, you get the group of American and European liberals who engage in this debate that's called the end of ideology debate. But if you look inside of the end of ideology debate, they're talking about worldview very often. And one of the key ones is Raymond Aron, who is a French sociologist. And he wrote a book called The Opium of the Intellectuals. He's talking about Marxism as a kind of opium for intellectuals. And in the German subtitle, it's subtitled, Or the Addiction to Weltanschauung. So he's telling German readers, hey, you better give up that Weltanschauung business because that's a bad position philosophically and politically. And he makes a statement that is, I think, typical of this liberal view of this period, which is pragmatic. So you should avoid systematic thinking. You should avoid, believing there is a total system of truth, and instead you should have a pluralistic understanding of truth or of knowledge. And so this is the quote. I do not believe in the validity of a system comparable to that of the communists. I feel detached from the preferences or Weltanschauung of the left or the right. According to the circumstances, I am in agreement or disagreement with any given movement or a given party. So this goes back to Max Weber, who in the 1919 urged German students, please, you have a worldview, but try to have as small a worldview as possible. If you want to be successful in the political realm, you have to be open to negotiation and to a pluralistic understanding of politics. Also because liberals are powerful intellectually and in a position in society, but in terms of numbers, weak. So if they form a party, a liberal party around Weltanschauung, they'll be a minority party. So he cautioned against that. So these are just four, and I go into more, but the idea is, if we look at how they all emerge together in time and sequence, they're taking elements from other worldviews and mobilizing them in interest of apologetic positions. And then you can see how the liberal tradition is taken up in recent political theory. So John Rawls, when he talks about the ideal political order, rejects what he calls comprehensive doctrines, right? That people that enter the public sphere with comprehensive doctrines, worldviews, so Catholic Church in a certain mode, communists, they should be excluded from effectively. They're not full ranking members of the public square. To be a good dialogue partner in the public sphere, you have to be more open. And Charles Taylor also talks about his rejection, his acceptance of secularism that is pluralistic and open, his rejection of secularism that has closed world structures. So that it's too closed off because it is a Weltanschauung. Okay, so I'm going to pass on now to Hugo, and he's going to talk about.
Yeah, thanks. So one of the questions that these different strands that Todd has laid out for us might conjure up is how do we look at them? How do we find them? And what kind of hypotheses do they raise? So when we're looking at these different strands of speech about worldview, we have a few hypotheses that we would like to test. So one of them is that worldview is somehow defined by and defines the culture war situation. So whatever it is, what we're looking for, it needs to be in some kind of combative culture war place, somewhere where that happens. The definition moves transnationally and does new work in different culture war settings. And in the 20th century, worldview becomes a term used by states to manage the religious secular conflict. So the question more or less is, where do we find multiple of these strands, and where can we also account for these three different approaches, these three different hypotheses? Our answer to that is to look just where they're actually debating with each other, which would be, in any case, in Parliament. So the proposal for this project, this sub-project, is to look at the parliamentary records of both the Netherlands and Germany and analyze there whether these hypotheses hold, and in general sort of have these large data sets that we can start analyzing for different uses of worldview and different interests therein. So why exactly focus on the German and Dutch? Well, I think the German speaks for itself to a certain degree, but in particular, the German and Dutch can be compared with each other because they have, at similar moments in time, a very different trajectory in how worldview enters into law. So here I have a translation from a quote from the Weimar Republic Constitution. So religious societies and societies that have the task to cultivate a worldview will be put on equal footing. And during the pacification of 1917 in the Netherlands, which was partly in any case about making sure that religious schools get similar opportunities as secular schools or state schools, we find more or less the following: public education honoring everyone's religion or worldview organized by law. Now, given that we have these similar moments when worldview starts making its way into Dutch and German law, it's interesting to see that both have a very different trajectory over time, right? So in Germany, right now, if you're talking about worldview, it's usually associated with the Nazis, right? Because the Nazis had this worldview dictatorship that talked a little bit about. Whereas in the Netherlands, our association with something like Weltanschauung or Levensbeschouwing is relatively positive, right? We still have levensbeschouwing onderwijs, and we're pretty okay with that. The idea is that whereas in Germany, this was the letter of the law, it was generally a dead letter. So there was a claim to organizing religious secular conflict here, but in many ways it failed. Non-religious associations had very much trouble arguing that they were a worldview. Whereas in the Netherlands, some of these worldview organizations tried to resist the label, but in the end got it. Right? So it's a very different development. And the idea is that if we use digital methods on these two parliamentary record sets, we can trace it to some extent. So what I'll be showing you today is a little bit from the Dutch case. So just to give you an idea how this sort of process looks like. So what we have in the Dutch case is a gargantuan set of hundreds of gigabytes of information, all annotated with all kinds of useful and non-useful information. So the first thing we need to do is get out something of this sort, which is a somewhat workable set of all occurrences of the word Wereldbeschouwing or Levensbeschouwing that have occurred within Dutch Parliament, with a set of like, who's the speaker, what year was the speech from, what was their political affiliation. From this basis, we can start doing some from this basis, we can start with extracting some illustrative moments within this development. So, for example, so I have here some of the different strands that Todd introduced earlier, and all of them do something different or do something similar sometimes when talking about worldview. So if we look at this Protestant member of parliament from 1886, right, he'll say something of the sort, at the battle of our minds of our day, there are only two worldviews, the Christian and the naturalistic, right? So there's a very clear identification. I'm in one of the camps, the opponent or the opponents are collected into the other camp, and that's what worldview is supposed to do here, like regulate this battle. At the same time, early socialists aren't as keen on it. So after, right, socialists fit relatively poorly in this schema, which is secularists versus Christians. So somebody like Toolstra might tell us, another Dutch socialist politician, what's the point of long speeches about the differences in worldview that we have every election, even though concretely in parliament, worldview only matters for very few topics, trying to downplay that this is even politically relevant, right? This is something maybe relevant for you when you're at home or when you decide to which church you're going, but it's not really relevant for when you're trying to organize a country. The liberals have another different kind of approach to it. So here, van der Linde, during this pacification where we enshrine worldview into Dutch law, he's the prime minister at the moment, he needs to defend this. He'll say something along the lines of, well, the freedom the Constitution guarantees is not only in favor of the professional school, so don't get this wrong, worldview is not just religion, right? It's a freedom for every direction, every worldview, and he'll go on to say even different pedagogical approaches or didactic approaches to how you organize schools. That's really, right, this goes a very broad thing. And in any case, right, he himself does not identify with any of these confessional or worldview positions. And it continues onward. So I have here somebody, for the short time that the National Socialists were in parliament in the Netherlands, we have here another case, which is more like the initial one, right? Really, there is a collision of two worldviews. The Marxist liberal capitalist, so everything together, and the folkish, which is consciously or unconsciously something that sprouts from farmers. So this is all in debates about whether or not people should be forced away from their farms or not, and whether we should industrialize. They say no, because the right worldview sprouts from somewhere else than the city. Okay, what this might give rise to is two intuitions, one of which I'll show you a little bit about. One intuition you might have is they're talking about it differently. I won't tell you a lot about that further today. And the other is that for some of them, it's very important, and for the others, it's a term that's around, we'll deal with it, but it's not something we'll have to rely on very often. The second one we could frame as something about engrams or frequencies. So this is my other role in the project, right? I'm also a digital humanist, so part of what I'm doing is trying to get these, operationalize these sorts of questions into questions that we can answer quantitatively, at least partially. So what we see here is an engram, or like a count of how often a certain word occurs over time in Dutch parliament. So one of the core ideas that we're pursuing is that worldview of Levensbeschouwing is particularly important for Dutch polarization, right? It gets enshrined in law when polarization starts, and it has its high point somewhere around the period of depolarization. So that's sort of a very soft initial indicator of what's happening that you might get from something like this. But at the same time, we were interested in these different strands talking differently and talking more or less. So can we go to that? Yes, we can. But I'll need to take you along very quickly why this is formatted the way it is and why this is formatted the way it is. So what we have here is, for example, if we look at the gray color, we have the period of 1901 till 1917. We have liberals and socialists below zero, which means they use the term relatively little. Exactly our intuition that we might have had from these initial quotes, right? And also from Todd's introduction of liberals critiquing worldview. And at the same time, we see Catholics and Reformed Protestants using it quite a lot. That means you can read this left to right, seeing, well, the liberals, except for a small hiccup, are generally the people who don't talk about worldview at all in Parliament, right? Even though they're critical of it, they hardly talk about it. Whereas Reformed and Protestant parties are very clearly the ones who are deeply interested in it. Okay. Okay. I think I'll keep it at that and hand over to
you. All right, so I'm Victor. I was an anthropologist working with indigenous people for a long time in Amazonia, and now I'm also looking at both the history of anthropology in Latin America, anthropology and history, and also more recently indigenous activism and how it starts to take over worldview. I'll start from the end, which is that in 2016, the Organization of American States signed a declaration on the rights of indigenous peoples that enshrines their rights to having their cosmovision protected. This is just one of the articles that enshrines this right, but it's there throughout. And it's not just in this document, but also the Inter-American Court of Human Rights has rendered has a number of judgments that recognizes the right of indigenous people to see their cosmovision protected. And the Bolivian constitution in 2009 enshrines cosmovisión in Spanish throughout the constitution, right? As something that both defines indigenous people. Indigenous people are defined by the fact that they have a number of characteristics and a cosmovisión. And then the development and all sorts of policies must respect the cosmovisión, or cosmovision in English. The fact that, so cosmovision in English appears increasingly. It's a literal anglicization of the Spanish cosmovisión. And in English, it appears as a synonym, but also as a distinct term from worldview. So here, for example, you have a slide I'll return to by a Native American activist, Tom Goldtooth, an American guy, who at a COP meeting in trying to oppose carbon trading, said that carbon trading conflicts with indigenous cosmovision / spirituality. And when defining the indigenous worldview, he says it's infused with cosmovision / spirituality, right? Where cosmovision in English for him seems to be particularly on the spiritual religious side, and distinct from worldview, which seems a more neutral term. So that was a very apologetic and activisty use, but in more academic uses, for example, by David Carrasco, who's a very important historian of Mesoamerican religions, based at the Harvard Divinity School. He, talking about Cortés, says Cortés's knowledge of native cosmovision, in parenthesis worldview, is found in 2 events associated with the ceiba tree, blah, blah, blah. And then in the footnote, he specifies cosmovision means the religious worldview of a people that contains their local codes about how space and time are integrated into a meaningful picture of the universe. So on the one hand, for him, cosmovision is a translation or a synonym of worldview. And then at the same time, he seems to say cosmovision is a very specific sort of worldview. It's a religious worldview of a people. It's ethnic, right? We go back to like the very early uses of like Indian, Chinese worldview in the early 20th century, very Hegelian-like. But also in his work, it's only indigenous people who have worldview, who have cosmovision, right? These are very bad engrams, I should say, but these are also engrams that show sort of the frequency of the use of cosmovision in the Google database. We don't know exactly what's in the Google Books database, which is why we can't fully trust this, unlike the work that Hugo does, which is very difficult. But it gives us a sense that at least from the 60s onwards, the word cosmovision starts to get used a lot more in English publications. A lot less than worldview, for sure. But compared to bigrams, that is like combinations of two words, like so indigenous worldview or Christian worldview, it's a lot more, right? And it seems to be rising. So there's something going on with cosmovision that seems to be increasing. And when we look at what's going on in the Spanish-speaking world, in Spanish publications, cosmovisión also rises from the 40s onwards, particularly. The dip, we're not sure if it's a real dip or if it's just an artifact of what documents Google decided to put in its database. But maybe there's a dip. And we can also see that even though Cosmovisión Cristiana, the Christian worldview, rises steadily since the 40s, there's a boom in indigenous worldview. Indigenous Cosmovisión Indígena started from the 80s and culminating in the mid-2000s, exactly when there's the Bolivian constitution, there's the OAS and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights rendering their judgments using Cosmovisión. Now, Cosmovisión is a really interesting translation for worldview because it's not a very good translation. So Eugenio Imaz, who was one of the first, who is the main translator of Dilthey into Spanish, he wrote something about, Dilthey is one of the main thinkers of worldview in the early 20th century. Imaz wrote about these different definitions, and he said, for me, Concepción del Mundo is the translation for Weltanschauung. You can have others, but that's really the proper one. And he talks about Cosmovision, and he says it's very pretty, but also in the sense of like it's picturesque, right? And it seems, from what I can, what I've found so far, it seems to emerge to be a folk translation, to emerge among German migrants to Argentina before the 1920s. The first mention is in 1920 in a newspaper in Argentina by a descendant of an 1848er. So someone who had to flee Germany in 1848 because of the revolution. And indeed, it's a literal translation in a certain way, in that it preserves the word order. It agglutinates the words, right? It's cosmovisión in one word, whereas in Spanish, we tend to prefer to separate, like to have multiple words. It keeps them in the same order. And then what it does, which is odd, is it translates Welt with cosmos, which already makes possible all sorts of different associations where it's not just the world, but it's the universe and it's space and time. And Anschauung with vision, rather than, for example, Concepción, which will be mobilized a lot precisely to refer to sort of ecstatic visions that shamans and indigenous religious practitioners have of the cosmos as a whole, right? So that's a little bit about the semantics. Now, there's a very early philosophical history, very thin, but early, that draws a lot on the German history. But I'll talk to you now more about the social scientific and the religious, early apologetic intellectual uses of the concept. And I look at three authors. Miguel León Portilla and Alfredo López Austin are both Mexicans. Enrique Dussel was Argentinian, but he's in exile in Mexico since the mid-60s. He recently died. All three of them talk about Cosmovisión in quite different ways. Miguel León Portilla, he's a historian of the Nahua people at the moment of the colonization, of the conquest by the Spaniards. And he's trying to show that Nahua people had developed something like a philosophy that's comparable to Greek philosophy. And that is, they had rationalized an originally mythical cosmovisión, worldview, right? He did this partly basing himself on what he calls a German school of Nahua studies, so a number of translations from the Germans, who had been looking at Mesoamerica at least since the days of Humboldt, right, who generated a lot of interest and excitement in Mesoamerica. So he thought that this new, that the fact that the Nahuas had something like philosophy could lay the basis for future Latin American philosophy. And the fact that this is in the late 1940s is important. There's a sense of Europe and European thought and civilization having failed, right, in a catastrophic way, and of Latin America perhaps offering an alternative to this. At the same time, as this is going on, he's also working at the Instituto Indigenista Interamericano, which is an institution created by the early Organization of American States. So one of these inter-American, intergovernmental organizations that is trying to establish a new world order, especially a new regional order. And there, by instituting collaboration between scholars and policymakers across American countries for the development of indigenous communities. So I haven't yet had the opportunity to look at the archives of that institute and what Miguel León Portilla was doing, but at the same time as he's working there quite actively, he's also quite very actively using the concept of worldview and of a Nahua cosmovision. In the 60s, Enrique Dussel, who is a historian, a church historian, a historian of the Latin American, of the church, the Catholic Church in Latin America, and part of, at the time, very new liberation theology. He had come back from Germany, and he writes a book with a very long title that I'll read, Hypothesis for the Study of Latin America in Universal History. 2 points. Investigation of the world in which the Weltanschauungen constitute themselves and evolve. Right, that's the full title. So again, part of the question is like, what is Latin America? What can it be for the future? What is the role of Latin America in world history? And as part of this, we have to understand all the Weltanschauungen. He keeps the word in Spanish, and he quotes Miguel León Portilla to say this is the Latin American worldview, the Latin American cosmovisión. Originally, it's the Nahua, something like the Nahua cosmovisión. At the same time, he's also bringing it, so you have for him these ethnic worldviews, and at the same time you have the opposition between Christian and modern worldviews. And he's trying to figure out how to combine, you know, Latin American versus European worldviews with indigenous, like pagan versus Christian worldviews. And his aim is to decolonize Latin American thought, and he's the forefather of decolonization, which then gives us people today like Arturo Escobar who really use cosmovision in this very political way. The last one, Alfredo López Austin, uses worldview in a very different way. He's a student of Paul Kirchhoff, a German Marxist emigre, right, exiled in Mexico. And he uses worldview to lay out interdisciplinary research program that will unite archaeology, history, and ethnography. And he thinks there's a core of the Mesoamerican worldview that has persevered over 2,000, maybe 5,000 years, right? And this means we can all work together to try to figure out how it changed, what has changed, how it continues to be the same. And at the same time, this should also help us understand that Mexico has always been a multicultural nation. Mesoamerica has always been multicultural, and it should continue to be, and we should valorize indigenous worldviews as free Mexican worldviews, a plurality of indigenous worldviews, but also as national ones. So what I want to emphasize, and I'll finish on this and I'll be quick, is that throughout all of this century of discussions of worldview in Latin America, it's continuously global. That is, everybody goes back to Germany. They have study trips in Germany. They have German exiles talking to them in Mexico. You have Argentinians moving to Mexico, going back to Argentina. Also from Mexico to the US, a number of intellectuals that go back and forth, translations that go back and forth. The scholar I mentioned earlier, who I'll return to here, David Carrasco, he is Mexican-American, right, and but working in the US. So all of that is going on. And, at the same time as you have this horizontal, like geographical movement, you have a vertical, but an interaction between, on the one hand, a very expert specialized science with articles like calendrics and ritual landscape at Teotihuacan, themes of continuity in Mesoamerican cosmovision, right? So very high science, use of it in a conference. You have interdisciplinary research programs that try to lay out something more general and talk across disciplinary specializations, La Cosmovisión Mesoamericana. You have textbooks on Mesoamerican religions. So that book by David Carrasco, widely used across the US in undergraduate programs, right? You have expert testimonies of anthropologists or historians in court saying this is the cosmovisión of this group or of that group. And then this is used, cited by the judges when they render judgment. And then that keeps getting cited by further jurisprudence. And then you have completely popular history. For example, a magazine, an archaeology, popular archaeology magazine you can buy in train stations, or in bus stations rather in Mexico, on La Cosmovisión de la Tradición Mesoamericana, and labels in museums here in the Mexican, the Museo Nacional de Antropología, about cosmovisión. Right. So it's perhaps easier for us to see it now because the sources are closer to us, but this is how the descent into social life happens, right? And these then leads to, it goes both ways, in that students who become fascinated by anthropology, by going to the museum, study, and then become themselves academics, right? So that what they learn, their understanding of cosmovision is shaped by this popular uses, which takes us back to someone like, for example, Tom Goldtooth and his appropriation of the concept in this very apologetic way again, right, in a very political sphere. So this is it. Thank you. This is just the first of our seminars, and we will have a number of other ones. Some of the people who will be presenting are listening to us right now. Anne Taves, religious studies scholar, who's developing the concept in major ways and using worldview. Same with João de Pina Cabral, an anthropologist who's been doing an apologetics for worldview in anthropology in some ways. But then also Michelle Chaplin-Sanchez, who will talk to us next month about more the sort of Christian worldview concept that Todd discussed earlier. David Ludwig, who will talk to us more about indigenous worldview. So all the different bits that we discussed hopefully will be expanded upon by these other people. Super. Thanks. Thank you.
We still have 20 minutes. We do have fine as a report. What we thought is to give the people online a chance to write something down if they want to write any questions or comments. We thought I heard this afternoon, this colleague said, after lecture, you let the people you're sitting next to, you talk to the people you're sitting next to about what you thought of, what you just heard, instead of starting with questions. Can we do 5 minutes of buzzing, or if you want, you can get up and go to the bathroom. Just like you can introduce yourself to the person you're sitting next to, and if you found anything valuable, does this bear any relation to what you think about or work on, or is it relevant in any way? Let's take a few minutes and we'll let the people online, if they want to pose questions, pose questions. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, all right. Thanks for sticking through a whole hour of talk. That requires bravery. So we did have some questions from the online audience. So maybe why don't you start with two from online, because they're mostly to Victor, because he said it's because he was the last.
It's because I invited. I'm the one who signed the invitations. I invited people who I knew. No, so there's a question about the influence of the Summer Institute of Linguistics, which is a Protestant missionary organization on Mexican anthropology in the 40s, and whether they use the concept. The easy answer is I don't know yet. But that's a very interesting question. I know I worked with missionaries related to SIL in Amazonia, in Ecuador. And I don't remember them using cosmovisión or worldview that much, even though they were very close to Frank Schaeffer as well. So I don't know yet. And then there was another question by Ante. Some part of it is broader for all of us, and there's a methodological question, which is we're looking at, so the question is, you are looking at the use of the term, but I don't get a sense of how people are defining it. Are you looking at that, specifically with respect to Lopez Austin's interdisciplinary research program? Is he using Cosmovision as an analytical tool? And if so, how does he define it? I'll just briefly say about Lopez Austin, but I think, Todd, you can say whether and to what extent we look at how people use how they define the concept analytically rather than just that and how they use it. Lopez Austin, yes, goes into a lot of detail for what he thinks Cosmovision is and is about. It's tricky to explain. It's because it changes a little bit. There's different books and so on. It's generally how people conceive the world, and he makes what he finds very useful in Cosmovision is that you can scale it from individual to collective worldviews, and then you can also see how a core of the worldview is preserved over long periods of time. For example, key metaphysical notions about what the gods are, how time and space work, what's the relation between this world and other worlds, whilst at the same time being able to describe how the periphery of the worldview changes with different ecological niches, for example, but also different moments in time. And key to this is how indigenous people today in Mesoamerica might be Catholic outwardly and still hold to a core of metaphysical notions about how space, time, matter, etc. function that go back thousands of years. So that's what he's interested in and the sense of how that works.
Can I just say something about that too?
Yeah.
Thank you, Anne, for that very good question. So I think in this seminar that we want to develop, we're interested also in definitional questions, like how can we define it as an analytical concept? How can it be used? But that's really just an offer to people in the room to get engaged in that particular question, because people are using it analytically today. And I'm looking over at Anja Visser over there, my colleague, who I think uses it also in her research. So, how do we define it? And I would like to have a conversation about that. As a historian, I don't begin from any kind of definitional perspective. I'm just interested in historicity of the definitions. Like, why is it that people derive certain definitions? What use did they have for people in essentially religious, secular conflicts? And Anne and I had an interesting exchange earlier where she said, well, isn't it a bit harsh to say culture wars all the time? Because aren't you often talking about dialogue and mediation? And I would say, oh yes, that's true. So when I talk about apologetics, I'm also interested in mediation and dialogue. And I think that worldview does work there as well. So that's just a little bit on definitions versus sort of more historical, critical approaches. Anyone in the room have a question for any of the three of us?
Well, that's the neighbor already, but do you make a difference what was your initial choice preferring Weltanschauung over Weltbild? Do you connect those? Because I think that is a term that is prominent in Heidegger and then is now used some media studies as well. It, of course, it brings more of a mediation with it. If you look at Weltbild, it has this mediation of an image in between. So is there a reason why you chose one or the other?
Well, principally that Weltanschauung is a term of political history, whereas Weltbild isn't. And I mean, what would be interesting to look at was why people chose Weltbild, right? So my understanding, and you have a more intuitive understanding of the German language than I do, but my sense is that Weltbild meant essentially more of a passive frame through which you perceive reality. So it could be your cultural paradigm, it could be your scientific perspective and so on. Whereas Weltanschauung has a volitional quality to it. You're forming also through an act of will your conception of the world, so that it's something that lends itself to the formation of group identities, because you have to will Weltanschauung. You have to, it's a willed conception of the world, whereas Weltbild is often more passive. So my sense is Heidegger meant the scientific modern perspective on things, which is something you're simply born into and learn. You don't have to sign up to it. You cannot get away from the Weltbild. You can get away from the Weltanschauung potentially.
Well, I know that the aim of the project is not to replace the word religion with worldview or cosmovision or Weltanschauung, pardon the German, but it doesn't come like I cannot think using religion and cosmovision together. So I understand that there could be a cosmovisión cristiana, but there cannot be a cosmovisión religiosa, right? So a religious cosmovision. So why are they cannot put together? Why can I not have a religious cosmovision approach to life? So
I think it's actually a question that you can answer. So, you do have people, and Taves is present with us online, who are saying we should replace religious studies with worldview studies, right? And she'll speak in January, I think, or February, and so we can have to be better placed than we are to answer that question in some way. And then Cosmovision has a slightly different history too. So some people from Latin America, when I tell them Cosmovision is a translation of worldview, think completely not. These are completely different things. And it's very much a translation of worldview, in that if you look, for 50, 60, 70 years really, every time someone would write Cosmovision, they put Weltanschauung in parentheses, right? That's what they were referring to. But worldview more generally, Weltanschauung more generally, tends to be about redefining the boundaries between the secular and the religious. So it's never fully religious, nor fully secular, and it's often trying to push the boundary in one way or another, in my understanding at least, but you can say more about this. And so right now, Cosmovision is used in a lot of circles as a synonym for heritage, right? Cultural heritage. But if you look at Goldtooth, for example, that North American activist who uses Cosmovision in English as a more apologetic concept, he clearly thinks of Cosmovision as something inherently religious, purely spiritual. Same with the other, like a lot of other people, right? So that's the concept moves. It's very plastic. It changes. People use it in different ways. And especially there's a difference in academia, in academic circle, we tend to neutralize the term and people will have very specific definitions. But in common usage, the way you're understanding is really shaped by the legacy of these struggles that you may have, or the result of these that you have experienced in your daily life.
And the interesting thing also is that if you look at sort of organized, systematic use of worldview, it always involves religion in some way, or spirituality. So people use it, maybe they'll talk about a politician's worldview. They may not be referring to religion then, but almost always the power of the term is because it connects to religion. So the idea of the indigenous cosmovision, I think if you try to get away from the spiritual aspect of it, I mean, in fact, you can't, but that's what gives it the power also, is the claim that there is this heritage, spiritual heritage, in the conception of the world from an indigenous perspective that gives indigenous people a special relationship to nature, to the world, and so on. And that's a very powerful idea. And you see it being taken up by climate activists all over the world. And many of them believe, they'll say it, we cannot solve the climate crisis without the indigenous worldview. So it's not just about the indigenous people who grew up with a different relationship to nature. It's also, behind it all, is this notion of a spiritual power that they have in connection to nature. It's a spiritual connection to nature.
Yeah. Should we take online questions? Because we can keep talking outside, but
Okay.
the people online won't have another chance. So Federico has a question for Hugo. I was surprised not to see Herder surfacing in the German prehistory of Weltanschauung. Could you maybe tell us something more about the trajectory of the concept in German Romanticism? And there was another question also aimed at you that asked, was the discourse about Weltanschauung only about contents, or was it also about methods? Like, how do you make a Weltanschauung, or was it about this is the content of a Weltanschauung?
Yeah. Thanks both Harman and Federico for those questions. So about the trajectory of Romanticism, the main hypothesis we have on that right now is that I noticed at some point that some aesthetic categories started rising, some categories that start introducing cultural denominations for worldviews. That's not explicitly that's not very clear cut that that's coming from German idealism. It might be coming from Hegel, but maybe something else is happening at the same time within German Romanticism. So I haven't looked at that very extensively, but that's the main idea there. And with regard to the question on whether worldview discourse is more on method or on content, so in general, the more academic the discussions are, the more often you'll find discussions of how to make sense of the concept at all. The more apologetic the usage, the less, and the more doctrinal it becomes. But that's not a clear-cut separation. So if you look at Dutch liberals, like from 1900 onwards, you'll find them explicitly talking about what worldview is in parliamentary debates, in order for them to say we're not something like that, right? So they're very much talking about what it means to have a worldview in order for them to distance themselves from it, not to sort of doctrinally divvy up the world into different worldviews. So that's not a clear-cut answer, but both occur. On the intellectual side, for example, someone like Dilthey would be a very good case of somebody who has very little stake in any particular worldview denomination, but will give us a complete view of this is how we must make sense of this category, and this is how it underlies our activity as humanist scholars and stuff like that.
Great. Should we take another question from the floor?
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. Very fascinating. I heard a little bit of the concept and design of it. Let's see a little bit more content and implementation. And I found it quite interesting to see the way that it moves from a philosophical category to a legal category. It seems like it's often used dialectically, like it's not in isolation, it's always over against something else. But thinking that on the other side of it being a legal category and knowing that the law is usually quite behind everything else is, I was curious about like what happens after 1990. Do you have a lot of sort of postmodern, detached, cynical, ironic people who say, I don't have a worldview and don't really care, and how do they fit it? I imagine the state would say they have a secular worldview. But those who sort of disavow this or having any connection to it whatsoever, would this be something that the legal apparatus or religious scholars of religion or philosophers would say, well, they have one and we'll define it for certain corpuses to kind of identify that? Or how would those fit within the purview of the project and contemporary political discourse, cultural discourse?
Well, I mean, it's a good question about people who don't identify with the worldviews. I mean, that is, in a sense, a liberal position. Like, I don't have a worldview, I think they're bad. You know, I suppose one could also say I just don't care about those sort of things. I think that the law wouldn't care about those people. They wouldn't try to force those people into worldview status, because I think what is going to happen in law now is that it's going to be freedom of religion and worldviews, freedom of religion, belief, and worldviews. So that you can now make claims, and people have been doing this since the 70s. So humanists, since the 70s, have successfully been making claims in the religious field for rights that the churches have, based on the idea of the equality of worldviews. You have, on the other hand, then, in places that are more secular nominally, like the United States, you have now Christian actors saying, everyone has a worldview, therefore we deserve to have religious schools, for example. So that's an argument made by Betsy DeVos, who is the former Secretary of Education in the US. Her husband basically said we need federal funding religious schools in the US because, after all, everyone has a worldview, right? So the state schools are secularist, we're religious. Why should they have their schools? So these kinds of arguments are.
But that's not a Christian category for the people. You know, for them to say we have a biblical Christian worldview, and that's the secular, atheistic, godless worldview. There are lots of people who have a big category that they're necessarily identified with it. Or do you think at base, all of these sort of intricacies of the biblical worldview, or whatever would say that I guess we have a particular way of doing totalizing the view of the world that is like this or like that Eastern Christian?
I mean, in one of the most popular books about worldview, there's a textbook on worldview that American universities assign a lot. It's called The World Next Door, I think, The Universe Next Door. And it's written by an evangelical Christian who's not a very conservative guy. And he says, no, there's this plurality. And there's like, I think, 8 different worldviews. He thinks the theistic one is better. But it's not like just a fight, and it's not just between 2. There's 6 other ones. Ultimately, yes, it is like the Christians against 5 variety of other things. But and like there's an Islamic worldview, for example. There's, you know, it's quite a more open thing. So I think I think in academia there was a moment where people were very against worldview because it seems to be too coherent. Right, to imply that people have a systematic, coherent understanding of the world. But in the past 10 years, or 20 years now, with the ontological turn, for example, there's a return to either this idea that actually they're very coherent, especially indigenous people have very coherent worldviews. Or you have people like João de Pina Cabral, who talked to us in November, who develop concepts of worldview that are open to precisely compartmentalization, the fact that they're open-ended, they're not fully contained, and so on. So,
and also there was a question from Professor Pina Cabral about African worldview, the African context, and how worldview appears there. And I don't know. I do have a friend who uses the term worldview to talk about Ubuntu philosophy as a worldview. And so she's promoting the idea of African worldview in her apologetic work, let's say, as a sort of spiritual New Age person a bit. So it's a kind of synthesis of like Kenyan philosophy and a bit of New Age thought as well. And then Ana Fernandez Abali, who's another postdoc with us, but she's right now in Spain. She's working with the concept of political ontology and asking about the emergence of ontological diversity. Is this parallel to the evolution of different uses of the term worldview? That's a very good question. This notion of ontological diversity, I think, is something that's coming up as a new norm in, well, we have a colleague who's interested in diplomacy and whether or not you should not begin from the perspective of secular framing to diplomacy, but rather begin from the point of view of ontological diversity, where you say, all religious or non-religious perspectives can enter into public debate, also at a transnational level, from the point of view of their ontology, so their reality, their spiritual realities, and so on. So that's a quite new development, and that's an example of where worldview thinking leads to attempts at mediation. So worldview thinking can lead to world culture wars, right? Christian worldview versus secularism. It can also lead to models of mediation, like saying we need to have ontological diversity. They're both, if you will, positions in culture wars. It's just one wants to sort of mediate, and the other one wants to fight.
great. Should we
Adjourn? Yeah.
adjourn and go for drinks? We don't want to keep people for too long.
So much.
Yes, thank you for everybody online. Thank you for people here. And I will send emails. If you haven't received an email from me and you want to receive emails from me, give me your email address and I'll send you news about the program and what's happening next. Same with the people online. Thank you very much.
Oh, yeah, sure. Matt is going to take a picture of us on the podium. Sure.
Yes.
That's good. And one more.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Really enjoyed it.